morning, and welcome to the Rocky Mountain MS Center's webinar series, Maximizing Lifelong Brain Health in MS. Today's topic is navigating the Social Security Disability System. Our presenters for today's webinar are Tom Stewart, an attorney and physician assistant who has specialized in providing both medical and legal care to people living with MS for more than a decade, and Patricia Daly, a licensed clinical social worker with more than 20 years experience treating MS patients and their families. We will also be joined by two patient advocates this morning, Cindy, who was awarded benefits at the initial determination level, and hopefully later in the program, Eric, who has experienced a hearing in front of an administrative law judge. The webinar is scheduled for 1 hour. The first 45 minutes will be a presentation and discussion by our panel, and the last 15 minutes will be reserved for questions from the audience. You can submit a question at any time during the hour by entering it in the chat window you see on your screen. Thanks so much for joining us today. Now here's Tom Stewart to get us started.
Thank you very much. So today we'll be talking about Social Security disability benefits and, to a lesser extent, supplemental security income, two related programs that both administered by the Social Security Administration. So it's a bit of a pessimistic kind of topic because, of course, what the issue is that many people with MS will lose or may lose the ability to earn a living, and the question will then become how will they survive? How will they replace what is lost if they lose the ability to work? So of course treatments are getting better, but it's good hygiene, I think, for everybody to know a little bit about Social Security, especially people who have a chronic disease like MS. So based on some old data, I'm not sure this is true anymore, 90% of people with MS had a work history. At the time of diagnosis, only about 60% were working, and then only 20 to 40% are working at about 5 years after diagnosis. So I tried in terms of the questions people might have. First of all, what is Social Security disability insurance? What is SSI? How do they differ? How do people get insured for purposes of Social Security disability insurance? What are the requirements for being eligible for SSI? And then, most importantly, I think people want to know what the probability of success is through the Social Security application process and what they can do to improve their probability of success. So,
this is Pat Daly, and just to start out, could you talk for just a minute about what we mean by disability? Because I think people have a notion that disability means nothing works, and my experience with MS is that disability can be a pretty subtle thing. Is that right?
Well, it depends on, disability is defined differently for different purposes legally. So what, for the Americans with Disabilities Act, for example, disability means one thing, and for Social Security it means another. Specifically, what Social Security means by disability is an inability to work, and that is technically defined as an inability to earn currently $1,090 a month, and that is expected to last for at least 12 months. Okay. And that's actually a particularly challenging part of the application process is for people to accept that disability means to apply for a disability, they can't be working, because there's sort of a cruel logic to it. If disability means you can't work, and you are working, you're not disabled. So people have to stop their job to apply for disability, and that's a very big leap to make. We have somebody here, Cindy, who's recently been through that process. Would you care to talk about what it feels like to go through that process?
Sure. In my case, I was working and, became to the point where I really couldn't go on doing and I was self-employed. So I think that it was twofold for me. And one was the fear of not having an income, which I've had all my life. And then the second was the fear of not being able to apply or get Social Security disability, and what would that mean for the future. And then there was another key to that, and that was just the emotional feeling of what would it be like when I am technically now not employed after I've been employed for so long, and what kind of a feeling and emotions would I go through because of that. And was I all of a sudden going to feel like I wasn't contributing and kind of having a job all my life? What would it be like not having a job?
So most obviously, people, when they lose the ability to work, they lose their income, which is terrifying in itself. And many people also will lose access to insurance, which is also terrifying, especially for people with chronic disease. Unfortunately, of course, Social Security disability insurance can address both of those problems, because an award of Social Security disability benefits will give people an income, and after a period of time, usually a long period of time, 30 months from the point somebody becomes disabled, they'll be entitled to Medicare. And so those two problems are addressed by Social Security. Of course, there are other consequences to stopping work, as Steve was talking about, which is loss of identity in some ways, and some of the other rewards of contributing to our community. So what people want to know once they learn that they generally have to stop working to apply for disability benefits, and that there is no advisory opinion. You don't know whether Social Security is going to find you disabled or not. People want to know what their probability of success is and how long it will take to have Social Security make a decision in their case. So there's a slide here that shows the process of Social Security that I think is very instructive. It's a bar graph. If we can advance to that one. Keep going, please. It's actually a little bit, it looks like this, yes. So this is an old slide. The numbers aren't exactly correct anymore, but this shows the process. This teaches the process of applying for Social Security very well, I think. So what people need to do is, well, if they are working, they need to stop working, apply for Social Security, and it takes about, with your initial claim, between, I'd say, 3 and 6 months. Cindy just went through this process, and it took her 4 months. And you can see in that slide that in this slide, 36% of applicants had their claims decided favorably right away, which is also concerning, of course, to people with MS or with any who are going through the process with any disabling condition, because many people have to stop working to apply, and there's even a probability that their claim could be denied. And then what happens after if you want to know what's next if my claim is denied, well, we live in Colorado. There is that next step, reconsideration, has been eliminated. So for people who live in Colorado, and we go request a hearing, and that can take a year. So it's obviously important for people to prepare very well for their initial claim, because the consequences of not having your claim favorably determined are very severe, and that you have to wait a year for a hearing, and then there's still no guarantee of success. So the reason in some states there is no reconsideration is that very few people have their claims favorably decided at that level, that Social Security decided it was too expensive and not worth the effort at that level because of the expenses involved. So, so another issue for people is when they Medicare, and Medicare technically, so Social Security has to make two decisions. One is whether somebody's disabled, and then two, Social Security has to determine when somebody became disabled. And with a chronic disease like MS, it's somewhat of a legal fiction because MS is not like a car crash. People slowly get worse, and so to say that somebody became disabled on a particular day is probably not precise, but Social Security needs to sort of pick a date anyway, and that date is somebody's disability onset date, determines when they're going to get their first check, and also it determines when they're going to get Medicare. Medicare begins 30 months after somebody's disability onset date.
So Social Security has to determine when you became disabled, and it has to determine if you're disabled. So how do they determine if you're disabled? What are the criteria for MS disability?
Right. So I have a slide on this too, that listing 11.09. I like to think of it as there are two ways to prove that you're disabled. One is to meet a listing, and the listings are on the screen, or will be soon. The one is disorganization of motor function affecting gait and station. The second one is severe visual impairment, and the third one is reproducible fatigue of motor function. It's very complicated, so I'm reading it with substantial repetitive activity. And this is very difficult to meet a listing. Social Security requires a very high level of evidence for somebody to qualify by meeting a listing. Now, if they don't meet a listing, then Social Security will consider the totality of their symptoms to determine if, given their age, their past work experience, and education, whether they can do their past work or any other work that exists in the national economy.
So meeting a listing means meeting one of those A, B, or C.
Right.
Right. What is disorganization of motor function? What does that mean in terms of what the average person would understand that to mean, or what is...
So disorganization of motor function affecting gait and station is, if you look up the rest of that as described in 1104B, you can find all of this online if you Google Social Security Blue Book, and then you can look at the MS listing, 11.09, and you can follow all of the minutia there, all of the reference for further references. But
yes, but I can ask you.
But so the way I think about it is, if disorganization of motor function means anything, it has to mean, it certainly includes, I should say, that somebody is in a wheelchair. So if disorganization of motor function affecting gait and station doesn't include people in a wheelchair, I don't know what it could possibly mean. So people with clear ambulation problems needing a wheelchair should have the easiest time of their application.
Using a cane?
Right. So that's where it kind of becomes a gray area. In my experience, using a cane intermittently would not be enough to qualify somebody for this listing, disorganization of motor function. So maybe in there's the gray area, like somebody using a walker. I think that would be one could make an argument anyway, that is disorganization of motor function affecting gait and station.
I think what I'm trying to get clear about is just having an MS diagnosis doesn't mean you're disabled.
That's correct.
And even having specific symptoms doesn't necessarily mean you're disabled.
That's right.
Right.
So for starters, no matter how severe your symptoms are, if you're earning over $1,090 a month, you're not disabled. Even if you're in a wheelchair, you're not disabled if you're earning that much money, because Social Security defines disability as
The capacity to earn money.
right. And so if you're earning money, you're not disabled. End of story. But but I think that in most cases, if somebody has lost the ability to walk, then I think their applications will go through the Social Security system pretty easily, if that's clear from the medical record.
But a lot of people with MS don't have physical symptoms that are that clear cut. Cindy, you do.
Mhm. Right. I have my scooter. I've had my scooter since 2008, and sometimes use a walker also. So, yeah, it became very visible and was pretty evident, that I'm disabled.
That you meet the
Right.
listing for MS is
Right.
the way I think about that. And of course, there are some people with MS. The most common disabling symptoms for people with MS are fatigue and cognitive problems, and that's where it can be very challenging for people with MS to get their Social Security benefits, because their limitations, their symptoms, should be measured and reflected in the medical record. And the standard neurological examination does not measure fatigue or cognitive problems. And so somebody with MS can be quite disabled in the sense that they have severe debilitating fatigue and with cognitive problems, and their neurological examination can be near normal. So if Social Security is reviewing somebody's medical records, they say, I'm so disabled I can't work, and they have a normal neurological examination, of course it's going to be a problem for their application. Of course, there are ways to...
So how do you get around that then?
There are ways to deal with that. One of the ways for cognitive problems, of course, the best way to do it is to have neuropsychological testing done. It's a little bit confusing, I think, to people who are evaluating the medical records, because in the neurological examination it might say mental status normal, and what that means is that the neurologist, that this person is oriented to date, to place, and they know their names. It's not an indication of cognitive abilities as they relate to the workplace. And I think the reason that's a problem is Social Security can see that and think that that was some kind of cognitive testing that was sufficient to determine whether they are suited cognitively for the workplace. What is much better is neuropsychological testing. And so that's formal testing, a battery of tests to measure specific domains of thinking, so very identifying somebody's ability to remember, to pay attention, and whether their speed of information processing is normal or not. So if that examination is done, I think that provides pretty clear evidence of cognitive problems. So that's a good thing to do for somebody who is getting ready to or thinking they might want to apply for Social Security, is to talk with their neurologist ahead of time and to discuss whether neuropsychological testing would be useful to help assess their cognitive abilities and their fitness for work from that perspective.
And what about fatigue?
Fatigue is challenging too. The way I like to deal with that is through occupational therapy testing, and to recommend that people have this done. So occupational therapy testing, and sometimes physical therapists do this too, can watch people actually perform specific tasks like gripping and standing, sitting, and measure actually how long people can do those before they need to take a break due to fatigue. And then I think that can provide some objective evidence of fatigue, which is what Social Security is looking for.
So I have a question for Cindy. All right. So you said that you've been using a scooter since 2008.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it is 2015.
Right.
So you worked for 7 years
Right.
using a scooter. So mobility impairment wasn't, even though that's what Social Security, that's the easiest way to qualify for Social Security,
Right.
Is to be unable to walk, yet you worked for a long time being unable to walk.
Right.
So I think that's a little ironic. But what about the other symptoms? So my question is, what about the other symptoms, fatigue and any sort of cognitive stuff? Were those a problem for you? And the second question is, how did you know? You said you knew that you couldn't work. Clearly it wasn't because you became unable to walk. How did you know that it was time for you to stop working? What made you think you should apply?
First of all, what I was doing was consulting work, which meant that I was going out to a client, and in my latest job I was facilitating committees and that type of thing. So I would need to go out to the client and do that. It also required that I have a lot of meetings with the client, going back and forth. From a fatigue standpoint, basically what would happen is, I would get too tired to get my scooter in and out of the car, or now I'm completely tired enough that I can't transfer from the scooter to the car and that type of thing. So I started seeing those symptoms and thinking that that's what was happening with me. So it wasn't a cognizant thing or anything, like I didn't have cognitive disabilities, but for what I did, it just kind of became time that it had progressed enough that I knew it was time to stop working. The other thing for me is the last job that I had became very difficult and very fatiguing to me, and I knew that basically once I finished that job, I really shouldn't be taking on anymore. And it was just, in my mind, it's like, this is time, because I'm not doing the clients any good, and most of all, I'm not doing myself any good from a health standpoint by continuing to try to keep up with all of that.
So I think what you're saying is, though, it was a process for you to figure out. It wasn't instantly, oh, I can't do this anymore. It was more of a, can I do this? I'm not doing, this is a problem. Is this getting to be more of a problem?
And with the way I am, I had to basically really ask myself a lot of questions, because I'm the type of person that will push forward no matter what. And so I had to really do some soul searching and say, and as a matter of fact, when I decided this is my last job, I then had opportunities for people wanting me to do more, take on more work. And I had to, at that point, say to them, no, in my mind, I had to say, this is it. You can't keep taking on jobs that are going to not do them any good and affect my health negatively.
So just one follow-up question for you, Tom. Because Cindy is in a scooter, did you have to prove the fatigue?
I think it's a good idea to include that, of course, all the limitations. I think that the salient part of the application was that in the neurological examination, Social Security could simply review it, see clear lower extremity weakness, disorganization of motor function. And in fact, what Cindy did was request that her neurologist actually document that she has disorganization of motor function in her legs that prevents her from independent ambulation. So really spelling it out for Social Security. But going back to the harder cases, which is, people with the so-called invisible MS symptoms, fatigue especially, I think it's important to have regular follow-up with your neurologist to document the fatigue along the way, even when disability hopefully is not going to be part of the picture. If it's getting challenging to work, please, I think you should talk to your neurologist about the way fatigue is beginning to interfere with work, and even ask your neurologist to chart that, because one piece of it will be that at least that symptom is recorded in the record, and I think it's helpful that it's recorded in the record over a period of time. And I think it's also a good idea to ask your neurologist to spell it out, that fatigue is a very common symptom in MS, and that given the lesion burden that somebody may have, or the whole amount of time they've had MS, of course it makes sense that they would have severe fatigue that would limit their ability to work. So I think it's a good idea from a lot of perspectives to make sure you're working with your neurologist, thinking about that. I mean, there's more to your medical record than just getting treatment. It also becomes sort of the history of your disease for other purposes.
One of the things that I hear people say frequently, well, I think there are two problems. One is that I think people sometimes don't know that things are MS symptoms. And then I think when they see their neurologist, they frequently don't talk about what all of their symptoms are, because they don't want to seem as if they're whining, or simply because it doesn't have time to come up. But certain things, like, for example, I've seen this happen a number of times when people have some bladder problems, so they have to use the restroom more often than the average person. That can be hugely impairing to your ability to work, in fact.
Right.
So to remember to tell your neurologist all these things isn't whining. It's simply creating a picture of the magnitude of the different little impairments that you have that can add up to a bigger impairment.
Right. Well said. And we've been talking about the medical record because I think that is critical and probably distinguishes a strong application from a weak application. But you also get to explain in your application how fatigue interferes with your work, and that's a critical part of it too. And how it interferes with your activities of daily living. So it's not just the medical record; it's what you say too.
Can we talk a little bit about the application process? Can we switch to that? Because I think it's interesting when people look at the Social Security disability application, and how I would like to ask Cindy a question, which is, you consulted Tom when you began the disability process, right? Would you have filled out that application differently before talking to Tom than you did afterwards?
I might have, yes, because I tend to not want to, I guess, recognize my symptoms as much as I should. I mean, I kind of downplay any symptoms that I have and think, oh, that's not so bad, or that type of thing. So, and also, with Tom, he could, they can go through and basically they kind of know the ins and outs of how to fill out the applications. If you look at the application, and if you look online at the Social Security Administration and their definitions of disability and that type of thing, I did. And I right away said, I am not going to do this. And, I knew that Tom was available through the MS Center, and that was the first, we just called up and made an appointment. And I would not go through it without help.
Thanks.
So why did you look at it and say, I'm not going to do this? What was it that was so daunting about it?
Well, it's just, it's kind of like you're going through and trying to understand it, and there's so much detail in it, and it's not well, it's basically put in a lot of legal terms, and it's put into kind of the government speak, and I basically couldn't really understand exactly, what they were saying about different things.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note here that you know government speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. I've worked with a lot of governments. In fact, that's what I was doing a lot of consulting with governments, and, it was very confusing.
And I think I think, Cindy, you touched on this a little bit. I think that for a lot of people, it is very hard to go from being in the workplace and saying explicitly or implicitly, you're just as good at your job as anybody else is. And then almost in a day, but in a very short period of time, changing 180 degrees what you're saying. You're saying, not only I'm not as good as everybody else at my job, you're saying Social Security and to other people that you're no longer able to work. And I think it's a very big change for people to make and very emotionally challenging to look at yourself in the mirror and realize, that you do have all those challenges that other people don't have.
And when you get into the disability determination part of the application, it's very detailed as to what you can and cannot do. And it was very eye-opening to me as I went through that and answered it honestly. It kind of made me face my MS symptoms and the disability part of it, because I'm always one that says, oh, I can still do that, I can still do that, I can do that on my own. And when I actually went through and did that, it was very eye-opening, and it was kind of a determination of, I've done the right thing.
Mm-hmm. And that reminds me of sort of a different part of the application, which is through the process. So if somebody has an application that was denied, then it goes to a hearing about a year later. And this is one of the challenges of preparing somebody for the hearing, is people are accustomed to being proud, and they don't like to admit all of the challenges they have. And I have to explain to people, no, this is your opportunity to tell the judge, tell an administrative law judge, why, how your life is difficult, how it's different from other people's. What is it like to have fatigue and cognitive problems and depression and bowel and bladder problems? And can you say that in front of the judge? Of course you should. You need to talk about all those things, but it's challenging. And you have intermittent visual problems. You have problems with heat. You have problems with numbness and tingling, or maybe pain. And I guess it's what you were saying before, Pat. Yes, you have to talk to the neurologist about it, but you have to put it in your application. And unfortunately, if you go to a hearing, because that means your claim was denied, you have to be willing to bring that all out in front of a judge.
Well, I think we ask people to do two things in the process. When you're working and when you have MS, and we say to people all the time, you can carry on. You can have a life with MS. People do things with MS all the time. And to focus on what you can do, not on what you can't. And then when you go to the disability application process, you have to really focus on what you can't do.
Right.
And I think that's a hard switch for people. And I think what happens to a lot of people, in my experience, is that they look at this and they say, but I'm not disabled. I can do tons of stuff. And so what I think is useful, and I found helpful when I talk to people about this, is if you have one bad day in 5, which is not uncommon for someone with MS, you have one bad day in 5 when things get progressed, and that's not horrible. That's one bad day in 5. But that's like 20% of your work time. Okay?
Right.
That's 20% of the work week. And how many jobs can you have if you can only show up 80% of the time? You can't.
Right.
You can't keep a job.
Especially
if you
since
show
that
up.
day is not predictable.
Right.
So it's like telling your employer, well, I can work a few hours in the morning.
Maybe if it's not hot.
Unless it's hot, right? And then I'll be in
or
tomorrow unless I'm having a bad day. Of course, that's not acceptable to an employer, right? And that's the variability of symptoms and the unpredictability of symptoms is a major limitation for people with MS.
So that factors into what makes it disabling, is the fact that you can't predict when it's going to hit, and you can't predict what's going to impact it. So it isn't like, I think there's this notion of disability is that you're in an iron lung. It's not that at all.
Right.
It can be really subtle. It can be like having a car that's in tip-top shape and everything works except that it doesn't have a right front tire, or that it doesn't work.
So I kind of want, I don't know if we can change topics a little bit, and we can certainly come back to what qualifies somebody for disability, because that's the critical question, but who is eligible for Social Security disability benefits in the first place? And it's a benefit for people who have paid Social Security taxes. So for people who don't have much of a work history, they're not going to have earned enough credits to be eligible to apply for Social Security disability insurance. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So how much do you have to work?
It depends on somebody's age. Of course, a 20-year-old will not be expected to have the same work history as a 40-year-old. But if you've worked 5 years within the last 10 years, you're probably insured. So, in other words, for somebody who has been working continuously, stops working, and then 2 years later they apply for Social Security disability insurance, they're probably insured because it's not been 5 years. Now, if they wait another 3 years, they may no longer be insured for purposes of Social Security disability insurance. So it's like any other insurance. So while you're paying your premiums, you're insured. So if you're paying medical insurance and something happens to you, in theory, your insurance company will pay for it. Social Security disability insurance is similar. While you're paying into the system, you're protected if you lose the ability to work. It's better than most insurance policies because you have that 5-year period of time after you stop working, during which time, if you become disabled, you're entitled to benefits.
So how much do you have to be paying into the system? Like if you were working part-time when you were in college, would that qualify as part of your?
Right. So on the amount of credits that so for every $1,120 you earn in a year, you get 1 credit. So if you 4 times that, approximately $5,000. If you earn $5,000 a year, you'll get 4 credits. So
someone who worked part-time in college?
They might have earned credits sufficient to apply for disability. Unfortunately, there is a trap. Not everyone. So there's another program when we talk about there's SSDI, which is for workers, and it's the major safety net for people with chronic disease, I think. There's another program also important to know about, and that's SSI. SSI is not like insurance. It's welfare for people who are unable to work and don't have any money. And so the rules for becoming disabled are the same through both programs, but they're very different programs. One, to apply for SSI, you have to be indigent. So that actually creates sort of a challenge for a particular group of people. You know, of course, MS tends to affect women more than men, and so for some people, they're sort of not eligible for either programs, and it comes up, in my experience, most often for the sort of the so-called stay-at-home mom. So if somebody stops working, say to raise children, and then and has MS, and over 5 or 10 years becomes disabled, and then had a plan to return to the workforce, but can no longer, that person, let's assume she's married and her spouse has an income, chances are she won't be eligible for SSI because of the spouse's income will make her, well, right, for both programs. Yeah. So for SSI, she's not going to be eligible because of the spouse's income. That's the welfare part of it. And for the insurance part of it, the SSDI, she's not going to be eligible if it's been 10 years because she hasn't earned enough credits recently enough. And so it's just for people with a chronic disease, it's another factor to consider, maybe doing some part-time work throughout your life so you don't lose that eligibility. So a lot of times people want to know too, if I think about what they might ask at an initial consultation, people want to know, well, what would my benefit be? And I have a slide here that sort of I used a few different examples. If the Social Security disability will be based on an average of what you get out will be based on an average inflation-adjusted calculation. So what your benefit is will be determined by how much you've paid into Social Security. So I have some examples here. You can sort of see that if somebody's earning about $25,000 a year, they can expect about $1,000 a month in Social Security disability benefits. People with $50,000 a year, they get about $1,500 a month, and then if you've been sort of inflation adjusted closer to $100,000 a year, then about $2,000 a month, and then there'll be more if you consider family benefits. So for people with children at home, they might have another 50 or even sometimes a little bit more. 50% more than that. So you can see the family benefit also listed there for at each income level. Another, I should have said too when we were talking about, sorry, this is a little bit all over the place, but to go back to the welfare, the SSI piece, one huge benefit to qualifying for SSI is not only the monthly income, but it comes with an award of Medicaid. And unlike Social Security, which has a 30-month waiting period for Medicare, SSI will get somebody Medicaid immediately.
So if you are approved for SSDI, there's a benefit for your minor children, is that correct?
Right.
Is that true with SSI?
No, there are no family benefits for SSI. And for another important difference is that for SSI, if you get any money, if you win the lottery, if you inherit some money, you can easily lose your eligibility. SSDI does not depend on that. So you can have as much, you can be a millionaire and receive and keep getting SSDI benefits.
And if you are on SSI, is there a limitation in terms of owning a home or owning an automobile or assets?
Very strict limits.
Very strict limits.
Right, and that's a whole different talk about what those limits are.
But that's not true for SSDI.
Right. You just have to have earned credits, be insured through Social Security by the Social Security taxes you've paid, and be able to demonstrate that you're not able to work, defined as earning $1,090 a month.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the Social Security definition of disability, because it really isn't about your physical limitations as much as your earning limitations.
Right.
Based on physical limitations.
Right. Yeah.
Which is sort of not how most of us think about disability.
Right. And when I meet with people, very often they say, well, I got MS 10 years ago, or I had whatever symptom 5 years ago. And honestly, it really doesn't matter if you're working because you're not disabled during that period of time. You have had MS for 20 years. So it's for many people who have MS, who get disability benefits, their date of disability, the onset of their disability, is when they stop working, which is the earliest that Social Security can find somebody disabled.
If someone applies for disability and they get denied,
right,
they can appeal it, apply for a hearing, and that's
right.
in Colorado.
Right.
And then what happens?
Then it takes about a year later, you'll have an opportunity to have that decision reviewed by an administrative law judge. And So the hearing's pretty formal. It's a lot at stake for people. It of course, produces a lot of anxiety to go to a hearing.
Yeah. Eric wasn't able to join us, but so he did go to a hearing, right?
Right.
So what happens when someone goes to a hearing?
Well, technically, the judge will go through a 5-step sequential analysis, find out whether the claimant has earned any money since the alleged onset date, and if so, whether that qualifies as substantial gainful activity. Find out whether they have an impairment, an objective impairment that limits their work. The judge will then think about whether there's a listing that the claimant meets. Step 4 is whether the claimant can do the past work, the work that they used to do. And then at step 5, the judge will consider, given all of the person's limitations, whether there is any other work in the national economy that they can do, factoring their education and their age and their past work. And very often there's a vocational expert who is going to be at the hearing who will assist in that process. And the judge will, after taking testimony, assess what the person's limitations are and ask a hypothetical to the vocational expert, who'll then look it up and say, well, given if this person can lift 10 pounds 33% of the time and can sit this much and stand this much, are there any, given that they're 50 years old and have a college degree, is there any other work in the economy that they can do? And that's then it's, if that's true, then what did the judge include all of the limitations that were established by the testimony and by the medical evidence? And then as the person's advocate, it's important to then point out those additional limitations and try to get the vocational expert to explain, if you factor also these other limitations, then those jobs that I just mentioned would not be appropriate for a hypothetical worker. Yeah, usually it takes about 50 minutes for a hearing. They're pretty fast. Again, it's hard I think I've been surprised sometimes. People say, well, do you have any trouble reading a book? Do you have any trouble following a recipe? Oh, no, I can do that just fine. Well, we just talked about that. So didn't you just tell me that you can only read for a few minutes before you have to put the book down? So people just have to elaborate on the challenges they have again. So, do you mind if I just ask an open-ended question to Cindy? Mm-hmm. For people who are about to go through this process, what do you think they would want to know? What would you want to tell them?
I would not do it alone. I mean, I worked with Tom, and I would not want to go through the application process because, it's scary to think you may have to wait a year to go to a hearing, but, you need someone who knows all of the ins and outs of it to guide you through it. Even with my case, I mean, Tom even said, this is a pretty strong case, with the scooter and everything like that. It was still extremely scary process to go through, thinking that if you didn't get it, you would have to go to a hearing. The other thing I would say is that you were talking about, what will your disability payment be? I've had an account at Social Security Administration for several years. They send you out your little things and say, these are your benefits. So I could know before I even came in what my benefits would be if I went on disability, and I could understand exactly what the income would be for that and measure it against what if I did try to keep working and that type of thing. So you can do that. You can kind of go on the Social Security Administration site and learn about it a little bit. But you know, I just said we're not going to do this, and you know, knowing through the MS Center that Tom was available, that was the way to go.
Thank you. So how about, can you tell what it felt like to know that you had been awarded a benefit and how you found out?
It's interesting how I found out. It was a huge relief. I mean, my husband basically wanted to ask me if I'd heard anything, because once you get through the process and send in your paperwork and they're reviewing your paperwork, you don't hear anything.
Right.
So, you know, I was bombarding Tom's office with, so what do we do now? And they're like, we just wait. So when I got it, it was a huge relief. But the way that I found out I had it was I happened to just pull up our bank account online and saw a huge amount that all of a sudden fell into it. And I thought, okay, I think I know what that is. You know, somebody didn't just put something in my account.
Was it just a bank error?
Yeah, it wasn't just a bank error. So then I went on my Social Security Administration site for my account and was able to see then exactly, you know, when I would be getting payments, how much they would be, that type of thing. And then probably I just got, and this was earlier in April, and I just got the packet from them basically saying you've been approved and that type of thing. So you know, it's a direct deposit, so you can watch your bank account and look for it, but that's how I knew.
But eventually they notified you?
Yeah, they did. And also you can, when you go into your Social Security Administration account, you can click on a verification letter that you can download, and so you don't have to wait until the paper comes to you. But because that takes, you know, at least a few weeks after you find out. So to me and to my husband and I, it was just a huge relief to know that we were going to have an income.
Right. Yeah, I think right now, Social Security Disability Trust Fund under pressure, and this Congress and President will have to address that. Hopefully they'll address that this year to ensure that Social Security benefits continue for people with chronic diseases who become unable to work. I think it's gotten a lot of bad press about fraud, and I think sometimes what's less well discussed on TV and the media is what it can do for an individual, and avoiding indigency. So it keeps people from becoming homeless. It keeps people access to care. I think it even helps keep families intact. And so I appreciate you explaining how it feels to have that, because it's critical for some people, and I don't think that's discussed enough.
I was curious in the slide that you showed earlier about the number of applications that are approved initially. I think it was like 32%.
Mm-hmm.
And then the number that were approved on reconsideration and appeal.
Right.
So, and I didn't do the math, but of all of the applications, what percentage of applications for Social Security disability are ultimately approved? It would seem to me to be less than 50%.
I added up that data, and it was just over 50%. But I think that it's becoming increasingly difficult to access the Social Security disability benefits.
So, we have some questions from our participants, and one question is, if you move to a different state from the one where your Social Security disability benefits were approved, does it affect your benefit?
No, that's pretty straightforward. You can move and your benefit continues.
It doesn't change. What about if you're in the application process
You can have your application moved to another state's venue, or keep it where it is. It's not a factor. You can have it moved to another jurisdiction. So I see here somebody asked about any work, and it's hard to know what was meant by that question. It says, does any work include low-paying jobs, such as working at McDonald's or Taco Bell?
I think it was referring to how much you have to pay into the system
to earn credit, to become
credit, yes.
insured by Social Security disability insurance?
Yeah.
Right. So yes, definitely low-paying work can help you earn credits. And again, if you there are two issues. One is how much you're going to get out of Social Security if you qualify for disability benefits, and the other issue is whether you're insured at all. And as I discussed earlier, if you earn approximately $5,000 a year, you'll have earned 4 credits for that year, and that's the maximum number you can get. So it doesn't matter whether it's $100,000 or $5,000, you've earned 4 credits and become insured. Of course, what the consequence is that if you've paid more into the system and you ultimately qualify, that you're going to get more money as a benefit, as a monthly benefit, if you've paid more in Social Security taxes and had a higher paying job.
So work 4 quarters. Okay. Do you have to work 4 quarters, or could you earn $5,000 in 1 quarter, and would that give you your 4 credits
the
a
latter,
year?
The latter, right. So you can earn all of your credits at once, right?
At once, okay.
So do you know the phone number for the main number for the MS Center? Okay, Sarah. So I'm fortunate that the center provides this service and allows me to answer questions even nationally for people who are about to go through this process. So please feel free. I mean, if you have individual questions, please call 303-788-4030, and I provide a free consultation for anyone who has specific questions about their own situation.
The other thing I will say about the program that we run here at the MS Center, the Social Security Disability Application Help, is that we come to the column every month or every issue of informs. Mm-hmm. So you can also get information through our magazine.
Right. So there's a question here about, somebody said, would it be best to visit my neurologist to talk about, I'm sorry, I misread the question. And, well, I want to address is yes, if you can, you would be very, you would have a conversation prior to applying, having the conversation with your neurologist, whether your neurologist supports your disability claim, and if so, please ask him or her to document that in the medical record. I think that's probably the single best piece of advice I would give to anyone who is going through this process. And then let me see if I can figure out what that other question is there. Still working part-time. So I'm not sure what this question is. It may be asking whether disability while you're still working. And the answer is, depending on how much money you make, yes. So if it's under $1,090 a month that you're earning part-time, you may apply for disability benefits. And Social Security may find that you're disabled despite the fact that you're earning some money.
I have a question. And do we have time for one last question? Okay. So sometimes I have heard people say that they've talked to their neurologist about applying for disability, and their neurologist doesn't support their disability application. And sometimes there are different reasons for that. But I think sometimes some neurologists may not be very knowledgeable about MS or may not be very knowledgeable about MS disability. And I think sometimes people then have to get another medical opinion. How is that a problem? How does one manage that?
It's very challenging when you have MS symptoms that are very severe that prevent you from working. Hopefully, your neurologist will be perceptive enough to appreciate that, to understand the invisible MS symptoms would be pretty basic. And to be willing to say so, I think it's part of his or her job. But what happens when your neurologist doesn't think you're disabled or refuses to get involved at any level? I'm not sure. A lot of times, one way to address that is to have a conversation with your primary care physician. You might find more support from your primary care physician, or if you have a physical therapist. But I do think it's best to try to assess who your team is and the medical team that will help you demonstrate your limitations to Social Security satisfaction.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I've actually had the experience where a neurologist didn't have a lot of experience with the disability application process, didn't particularly want to get involved, but I believe this was someone who also worked with you, when they ended up getting reports from the occupational therapist or from the cognitive therapist supporting the disability application, then the neurologist felt more comfortable supporting the disability application.
That's right. And then I should say, too, I have an example, a slide here of a sample letter that claimants can ask their neurologist to write. So if we can go to that, thank you, that's it. So, this is that disorganization of motor function problem again. So this is the easiest letter, really, to ask of a neurologist if you really have a serious gait disorder. So, having asked the neurologist to simply write a letter, and if you give this, I think it gives something like this. There are no magic words, really. But if you give something to your neurologist, hoping, making it easy for him or her to support you, I think that will help too. So I have, just have asked the neurologist to say how long he or she's been managing your care, when you were diagnosed with MS, or what other comorbidities might there be, and then if it's, in the easiest case, again, where there's a severe gait limitation, ask the neurologist to put in some language like that. So I think that's all we're going to have time to talk about today, but I'd like to remind everyone, I'm definitely available for specific questions. We've said the number before, 303-788-4030. If you have any more specific questions, I'd be delighted to help. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you in particular to Cindy for spending some time with us this morning or this afternoon.
And all of these slides will be on our website. Yeah. And the webinar is on the website too.